Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Jim Dao, the editor of Globe Opinion. When it comes to veterans, no one at the Globe has written more than one man. My guest today is columnist Kevin Cullen, who joins me in the studio. Like Kevin, I've spent a fair bit of time talking to and writing about veterans. I've often found their stories to be heartbreaking, full of loss and trauma. But I've also often found them to be tales of resilience and renewal. Either way, the personal stories are essential to the American story because they reveal the lasting price of war. Kevin has captured all of these things in the scores, maybe hundreds of columns he has written about veterans. And now he has a news story that blew me away about one veteran and his decades-long quest to find peace. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So you've said that this story is one of the best you've ever written.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about Ed Kochanowski and Paul Grasso.
Well, Ed grew up in South Boston. He was literally conceived in the ruins of World War II. Ed's parents met in a refugee camp in Eastern Europe. I don't know if it was Poland or somewhere in that area. And they emigrated to Boston. Ed was conceived in that refugee camp. But Ed told me that as a young man or as a teenager, he noticed how damaged his parents were. They eventually drifted apart and split up. And when he was 16 years old, he got permission from them to join the Marine Corps.
And this is during Vietnam.
This was during the Vietnam War. He would have been in Vietnam when this fellow named Paul Grasso shows up. Paul grew up kind of, as the crow flies, maybe 2 miles across Dorchester Bay in Quincy, which is a city that borders Boston. And Paul would have grown up in a completely different environment than Ed. If Ed was this kid longing for some sort of sense of normalcy and belonging, Paul grew up as the baby in this loving, big Italian family in Quincy. Paul was one of these kids. The one thing that really struck me when I talked to his brother Ray and his wife Susan is that Paul was like a jock. He was like a really popular, great athlete, great baseball player, great football player. And but he was one of those jocks that didn't look down or didn't think he was the big man on campus, and he was very friendly. In fact, Ray got a letter while in the middle of this reporting process before I wrote anything. And it was from a woman who was a classmate of Paul's. And she said she just wanted to let him know, I never forgot him. I always think about him because he was our classmate. And he was very kind. That's the way she described it. And that story to me, it just made me think that I know kids like that. I know athletes and popular kids that were always kind to the least popular kids. And it made me think quite a bit of Paul as a person. In September of 1967, Paul got a tryout with the New York Yankees. It was up in Vermont, where I live now. And Ray, his brother, told me there were 600 kids, various baseball players from all over New England invited, and only 60 of them made the cut. And Paul was one of them. So his family is like, wow, this is an Italian family. They're thinking he's going to join a team of Joe DiMaggio and Yogi Berra and all these great Italian, Phil Rizzuto and all these great Italian players, and they're all getting excited. And then Paul just drops a bomb on them, say, hey, by the way, I just enlisted in the Marine Corps.
Can you talk about that decision a little bit? I think we've both met veterans who, look like they were young men who seemed to, going places in business or school, and then they decide to enlist or sign up instead. What motivated him, do you think?
I think you have to understand, and this is one of the things I tried to capture in the story. Boston and the working class cities, like when I grew up in Malden, and on the north side, just north of Boston, and very similar to Quincy. In the rich suburbs of Boston, there were kids desperately trying to get deferments. Kids that probably didn't even want to go to college were going to go on the 8-year plan, like Blutowski in Animal House. I'm going to stay in college as long as I can to avoid the draft.
Yeah, and people will forget that the draft existed then. Yeah. It was ended after Vietnam, but
Right.
it was very much a huge issue back in the 60s.
And that's why it's kind of one of those defining characteristics of the sort of the claves that we see in our culture today. You could trace back to them when, poor kids and kids that didn't go to college either got drafted or like kids like Eddie and Paul, they signed up. They went of their own volition. Eddie just went on his own. He described a very poignant scene of his buddies from D Street getting all the local girls, and they lined up and they all kissed him. And then he said he just got on the train at South Station to go down to Paris Island and holding a vodka bottle out the window. So these guys meet and they just happen to be assigned to the same unit, and they would have gravitated to each other because they had accents like mine. Their youth would have been similar, except Paul had this incredibly warm family that was all there, and his sisters, fussed over him, and Eddie was alone. And so I remember the other thing Ed told me when I did the interviews with him, he said that Paul was always like talking about his family, and I couldn't. I didn't have any stories to share with him in that. Yeah. But he said he was going to fix me up with his sister, one of his sisters, and then, obviously. We get to that fatal day in the river near Khe Sanh.
That's kind of one of the amazing things about the military is it brings people of very different backgrounds or family experiences together. They were both from Boston, but from different kinds of families. And the military puts them together and they become friends. But then it has a tragic turn. Tell us about that.
This is in May of 1968. And they're fording a river, and as Ed explained to me, these Marines were going about waist deep, and they're going across the river, and when they would get to the riverbank, the Marine that would climb the riverbank would then turn and help the Marine in back of him. Paul was directly in front of Ed, and so all of a sudden, while he's in the river, just about to get to the bank, the strap to his mortar pack just snapped or broke, and Ed grabbed it with one arm, maybe two. He had his M16 rifle, and had to keep that out of the water. And so he's trying to hold the mortar pack with one arm, and then just now Paul mounts the riverbank and looks back to help Ed and sees that Ed's really struggling. So Ed holds out his M16, and so then Paul latches onto it and starts pulling him up the bank. And just as Ed's getting to the top of the bank, a shot rings out. Ed fell backwards into the water. Paul fell gravely wounded on the riverbank. When Ed came out of the water, he told me he thought they were under fire. And then it dawned on him that it was his rifle that went off. Somehow, he said, in his movements to save the mortars from going into the water and keep his rifle up above the water, he hit the safety. He assumes that's what happened because he thought he had the safety on. And so he gets up there and finds their sergeant kneeling by Paul. And the sergeant was telling Paul, "You're going to make it. You're going to make it. Don't worry about it." And he said that Paul was, joking. "Yeah, I'll be okay." Blah, blah, blah. And Ed told me he died within 5 minutes on that riverbank.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about how that affected Ed.
We talked quite a bit about this. Ed said that obviously he was just racked with guilt, and they sent him to a doctor in the DMZ. They took his gun away, they took his grenades. So he's saying, "I'm not a soldier, I'm not a Marine anymore." And the doctor felt bad for him. He goes, "Hey, kid, I can send you home right now." And Ed said, No, I got to go back to my unit. I got to go back. So we did go back. But he said that as soon as he walked in the room, nobody said anything. Nobody talked. He felt eyes were on him. He felt that these guys didn't trust him anymore because he shot and killed one of their brothers. And Ed said it was more than just these guys. He said that, the officers said, "We got to move on. It's terrible what happened to Paul." The officers are worried about cohesion. They're worried about keeping these guys in a fighting frame of mind. And so you just got on with it. So no one talked about it, as if it didn't happen. Right. But Ed said, people didn't talk about it, but that's fine. But I knew that they were looking at me and they were judging me, and they didn't trust me anymore.
Right.
And then within weeks of that happening, I think it was about a month after Paul was shot, Ed got blown up. And next thing he knew, he woke up in the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia. There's no room for him at the Soldiers' Home in Chelsea. That's how bad it was back then. That's how many wounded there were.
Right.
So then while he was recovering from his wounds, he was informed that his unit got whacked back in Nam, and he said it was 4 or 5 guys got killed. Some of these would have been the guys that they were with when Paul was shot. And so Eddie had bad survivor's guilt to begin with, and this just made it worse, that he's in a hospital in Philadelphia and all his buddies just got killed in Vietnam. So he got released from the hospital, and there was no follow-up treatment for a guy like this. I mean, you got to remember, 50,000 plus guys got killed over there. And there were no services for him. So he came back to Boston. He came back to Southie. While Southie would have respected them, the greater Boston area, particularly like in Harvard and MIT, there were anti-war protests, and soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors were treated with open contempt. Yeah. So while Southie would have respected these guys, the wider community would have not.
Yeah.
And so that was very difficult for Ed to deal with.
So Ed managed to avoid Paul's family on a couple of occasions, and then he actually ran into Paul's brother, which is an amazing moment. Tell us about both of those things.
Well, Ed, when he came back from Vietnam, he guessed correctly that the first Memorial Day after Paul's death, which would have been May of 1969. Paul was killed in May of 1968. He guessed correctly that the family would visit Paul's grave on Memorial Day at the Wollaston Cemetery in Quincy. So he went there with the intention of approaching them and telling them what happened. But he said that he just lingered in the distance, and Ray Grasso told me that his mother, Carmela, noticed some fellow in the distance and described him as a young man with haunted eyes. And Carmela Grasso actually called out. But Ed told me he just walked away. He just couldn't bring himself to, in that moment, to approach them. And then some years later, at a dedication of a memorial to Paul in Quincy, Ed attended the ceremony, and the Grassos were there. And again, he said he was gonna meet them and tell them what happened and introduce himself and beg for their forgiveness and all that, but he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Wow. And so 57 years after that fatal day on the riverbank, Ray Grasso walked into Chuck Ayers' auto body shop in North Quincy because his daughter, Amy, had borrowed his van and got it dented, and she felt terrible. She said her and Tim, her husband, would pay for it, and suggested that Ray bring the van to Chuck Ayers' place because he had worked for her before and did very good work. Ray just handed his registration to the fellow behind the counter to get a quote for the damage. The fellow behind the counter was Ed. Ed looked at the registration, the name. He looked at Ray and said, "Did you have a brother who was killed in Vietnam?" And Ray was taken aback and said, "Yes." And Ed said, "We need to step outside." When they stepped outside of the auto body shop, Ed said, "It was me." And they fell into an embrace. And they hugged each other. And at some point, Ray pulled away and said, "We never blamed you, never." And Ed was able to quickly fill in some of those blanks. And both of them separately, when I talked to Ed and Ray separately about this, they said that moment, they felt like a huge weight was lifted off them in that moment, that finally the Grassos knew what happened to Paul, how he died. And he died helping Ed. And Ed was able to unburden himself and explain to them what happened that day, and that it was an accident, and that he felt horrible all these years for it. And that's, to me, when the story gets good. Because up until this point, it was a pretty sad story. But the bottom line is the Grassos have embraced Ed and have become that family, that close-knit, loving family that Ed always desired, but didn't get when he was growing up in South Boston, because his family, his parents, were victims of war themselves. They were walking wounded. They suffered so grievously during World War II that they couldn't stay together. And so Ed was, you could argue that Ed was an orphan of war. And now in this moment, this incredibly powerful, redemptive moment that shows what love and forgiveness and empathy can mean. Ed had that family, and it was the Grassos.
You had a nice way of describing the different situations of the two families. In Ed's case, he was scarred by the knowledge of what had happened in Vietnam. And in Ray's case, to some degree, the family was scarred by what they didn't know.
Exactly.
About that.
One of the greatest books I read about war was Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. And I made a direct reference that Ray and Ed were sort of the prisoners of the things they carried. And it was Ed's case, it was knowing what happened that day. And in Ray's case, it was not knowing what happened that day. And so this is where the story comes full circle. And I remember Susan Grasso, who Ray's wife, who, as far as I'm concerned, makes the best chicken salad in the world. She told me that Ed coming into their life and has just closed this circle of grief that this family had, and that they love him and respect him. And I think as much as Ed was able to be, born again in a spiritual way, I think it's this final embrace of this family that has really healed him. I didn't put this in the story because it's more just me and Ed and Ray talking and trading messages about Red Sox and Patriots and stuff. But Ed made some reference about he knows that he's going to be reunited with Paul one day. I think that the story is about so many different human emotions, but I think at the end of it, the most powerful emotion throughout this story is love.
More of my conversation with Kevin Cullen after a short break. Kevin, what has motivated you to write so much about veterans?
To be honest, Jim, I don't think it was until I started having conversations with you and Anna about doing this podcast that I didn't really kind of sit back and think, why do I write about veterans so much? It really made me think about my dad, because my dad was, he grew up in Malden. His dad was like a DPW worker. He had to be the only white kid in Malden nicknamed after Duke Ellington. His nickname was Duke because he was a jazz nut. But he went off to war, and it wasn't until he died. He died at 65. He was a firefighter, and guys that I met after at the wake and the funeral, some of them served in the military with him in the Navy. They described my father as this happy-go-lucky guy who just loved jazz and just loved music and was always singing, always dancing. And then he came back from the war. He was in the Pacific for 3 years, and he was a different man, a different person. My dad was alcoholic. He, had a drinking problem as long as I could remember, and he was out of the house quite a bit. The other firefighters would cover for him. You get thrown out of the house while you sleep in the firehouse. You shower at the firehouse. You eat at the firehouse, and you go on. And I don't know when it's dawned on me, but I kind of never judged my dad. I wasn't angry at him that he was, that he was this person that struggled with alcohol. And I think somewhere there would, by osmosis or whatever you want to call it, I kind of figured out that my dad suffered really badly during the war. I mean, like I said, he never spoke about it. I tried to engage him, particularly in my 20s when I was a newspaper reporter by this time. And several times I tried to bring up the war, just something, shoot the shit, whatever, talk about, and he just wouldn't go there. And it wasn't unusual for his generation. Those guys, World War II guys, weren't big talkers about that stuff in general. But it was only after he died that I learned from other people who served with him that, he saw a lot of, he was a Navy flyer, not a pilot. I think his title, military, whatever, is like radio man, but he also like dropped the bombs and hit and manned the machine gun in the plane. And those planes flew off aircraft carriers in the Pacific. And that what they did is, before the Marines would land, these Navy planes would fly over islands in the Pacific that the Japanese controlled. And they would strafe the beaches from a pretty low altitude and bomb them. So my dad, I'm presuming, would have seen the faces of people he killed. I think, like I said, by the time I was in my teens, I kind of understood, even if I didn't have a name for it, I didn't know it was post-traumatic stress. And my dad eventually found some kind of sobriety, and he ended up on lithium for his depression. And the last 5 or 6 years, he had a pretty good 5 or 6 years, and he was very involved in this. It's called Club 24. Which is it's a program, a 12-step program in Malden that gets people sober. And I recently met the chief probation officer up in Lowell District Court. The probate is a woman who was an addict years ago, and now she's the chief probation officer. She told me she got sober at the Club 24, and that made me really really admire my dad. But I think I write about veterans because because of my dad.
Well, what, after all your experience writing about veterans, learning about their stories, do you think you would say to your dad today?
I would love to have just talked to him about what he went through and give me a better understanding. But I don't think I ever told my dad that, that cliche, "Thank you for your service." I don't think I ever told him that I was proud of him, that he was part of the greatest generation, and that at great cost to him and to our family, he went and helped save the world from fascism. And I never told him. Maybe I write about veterans because I can tell them, but I never got to tell my dad. I admire what they did. And at the same time, Jim, I'm so angry at our government and that we don't take care of these people. We love veterans on Veterans Day. We love those who served and died on Memorial Day. You know what? Those 363 other days, we don't give a shit about these people. And it shows with the amount of services that are needed. Trying to get services from the VA should not be as hard as it is. I guess you could say back in World War II, we had the excuse of ignorance. So we didn't provide services for people like my dad. You were just told to get on with it, raise a family, get a job, do the things. And, oh, by the way, we'll give you a VA loan so you can buy a house, and we'll give you health care for the rest of your life, blah, blah, blah. And it's, yeah, sure, health care the rest of your life. To this day, we have 20-something veterans killing themselves every day in this country. That's an indictment of this country. We don't have the defense of ignorance anymore. We know what's going on with folks who serve and the challenges that they face getting back into civilian life, particularly combat veterans, but not just combat veterans, because as far as I'm concerned, the military hasn't done nearly enough to confront the scourge of sexual assault. Every once in a while, I'll hear from a reader who just says, "Oh, you're like a pro-military fascist," or something crazy like that. I said, "No, I'm not. I love our vets, but I know the foibles and problems of our military, and a lot of it just comes down to bad people who are not held accountable, and often by commanders who don't want any of that on their watch. And it happens in all institutions protect themselves, and they protect themselves at the expense of individuals who are harmed by those institutions, because institutions care about, I've seen it my whole life as a reporter, whether it was the church, the FBI protecting Whitey Bulger and letting them kill people, or the military, certain facets of the military. They don't care about their service people. They care about their own reputation. They care about their unit integrity, and they care about the next promotion.
How have you found the response to your stories? Because I can talk from my experience that it almost felt like for a lot of readers, it was like you were exploring a foreign country. Yeah. Because so few Americans today actually have a direct link to the military or to veterans. Yeah. How have you found it?
Well, I always call it, we always talk about the 1%. We describe it as the people that are rich and the others who aren't. But the other 1% is those who have served.
Right.
And so 99% of the country hasn't. And I think there's the other interesting thing about the Vietnam War tore this country apart. And one of the lessons that came out of that is we decided to get rid of the draft, which was wildly unfair, because if you were rich enough, connected enough, had bone spurs, you could avoid military service. And poor kids mostly went off and fought these wars. And not just poor kids, because it always angered me that Harvard, and I wrote about this, Harvard wouldn't let ROTC on the campus, sort of this hangover from the 70s. And then you'd walk into Memorial Hall and just see the names of all these Harvard guys who went off to war, all the wars, including Vietnam. Their names are right there. They died serving this country. And they honored Harvard with their service, and Harvard, because of some silly, I don't know what I would call it, like some sop to the whole anti-war movement there, that they wouldn't allow the ROTC. It was so patronizing. So Harvard kids, we can't let them be recruited to the military and become killers. What a bunch of nonsense. The tradition of Harvard is written on those walls.
Looking back on all your writings on the subject, what do you think has surprised you most about veterans and their place in America?
One thing, and Ed and Ray did comment on this. We talked about it after the story appeared, because the comments they were really very warm and generous comments. And Ed and Ray and Susan and the whole Grasso family took a lot of comfort from that. And I talked to Ray, and more traded messages, Ray, me, and Ed, that the culture has come a long way. You can be angry about Vietnam, a war that shouldn't have been fought, but be angry at the politicians who did it. Don't be angry at the teenagers we sent over to fight it. And I do take some comfort. I think the country has come through that by and large. But again, I don't. I wish that we, as a culture, embraced and loved and supported our veterans more than we do. And I think we have a long way to go to improve that.
Kevin Cullen is a columnist at the Boston Globe, and he specialized in veteran stories, among many other things. We'll link to his latest piece in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Jim. I really enjoyed it.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kusmer. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. If you like the show, please follow us and leave a review. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Jim Dao. Thanks for listening.